I have seen numerous old photographs of the Minnesota Central Railway line from Mendota to Fort Snelling, but figuring out what happened to it was quite a challenge. In the mid-1860s, the Minnesota Central began construction at Mendota, Minnesota. It built one segment south through Northfield, Faribault, and Owatonna to Austin, Minnesota. The second segment was built from Mendota to Minneapolis, passing below Fort Snelling. This is the portion of the railroad line we will focus on. Here is an 1873 map of the Fort Snelling and Mendota area, which has always been a transportation artery through the state of Minnesota. This is the area where the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers meet. There was also a road network that ran through the area, as shown by the black lines. In order to cross the rivers, there were two ferries that operated at the junction as well. In 1865, two new railroads were building through the bottomlands, the Minnesota Central and the Minnesota Valley. However, it was the Minnesota Central that built the line from Mendota to Fort Snelling. The main thing that confused me was the path of the Minnesota River, which the 1873 map showed branching into a Y by Fort Snelling. After the 1965 flood, the Minnesota River was straightened near Mendota, so modern aerial photos are completely different than old maps. General G.K. Warren published this map of the junction area in 1878, which provided a cross-section of the river valley at three different locations. Line A was across the Mississippi River at Fort Snelling, which had high bluffs on either side of the river. Line B was also across the Mississippi River, just downstream of its second junction with the Minnesota River. The bluffs were still high on either side of the river, but there was a lot more space for the river to spread out during flood events. Finally, Line C was across the Minnesota River Valley between Mendota and Fort Snelling. Like Line B, there was also a lot of room for the river to spread out during flood events. This 1873 map shows the Minnesota Central line from Mendota to Minneapolis. The branch line started at Mendota, passed below Fort Snelling, swung by Minnehaha Falls, and ended in Minneapolis. This is one of its depot buildings in Minneapolis. G.K. Warren produced this map of the junction area in 1867. The map showed the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River, and stated the bluffs were about 150 feet high around Mendota. This old photograph shows the high bluffs around Mendota. Let's focus on the area within the red rectangle. If you remember, the area within the red rectangle actually had three railroad lines passing through it. The Minnesota Central line between Mendota and Fort Snelling is the hardest to see, as it cuts across the bottomlands of the valley. The Minnesota Valley Railroad is probably the easiest to pick out, as it was cut out of the bluffs on the opposite side of the river. The other segment of the Minnesota Central, which branches off toward Austin, Minnesota, is shown on top of the bluffs, and there are actually two strings of rail cars or trains barely evident. The map also showed that the Minnesota River could average about 15 feet deep in this area, but there were bad sandbars too, which could stop steamboat traffic during low water stages. When the river was high, steamboats could pass through this area freely. This 1874 map shows the Mendota area and the overlapping railroad lines. If you stood along the bluffs to the east of Mendota and looked to the southwest, the first thing you would see is the Mendota Depot, although it was pretty small. This is another look at the Mendota Depot from the opposite side. The photograph also shows the lower branch of the Minnesota Central, which branches off to Fort Snelling. Just above the branch line was the shared track of the Minnesota Central and Minnesota Valley Railroads. The difference in elevation between the two lines is already evident, even at Mendota. Finally, hiding in the upper right corner of the photo is St. Peter's Catholic Church. Just south of Mendota today is an overlook at Quarry Island. At the overlook, you can see the old Minnesota Valley Railroad line below, and the floodplain of the Minnesota River beyond. This overlook is aligned with some of the runways of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, so you can almost reach up and touch some of the airplanes. This is an 1896 map of the Mendota and Fort Snelling area. Again, the main features are the Mississippi River, the Minnesota River, the main roads that run through the area, and the 2 railroads. Just to the south of Mendota, there is another overlook of the area called Pilot Knob. Seth Eastman painted the view toward Fort Snelling from this spot nearly 200 years ago. This was a sacred spot to the Dakota people and is currently being preserved for the next generation to enjoy as well. From this excellent vantage point, you can see the Mendota Bridge and the city of Minneapolis. This is the view of Minneapolis through a zoom lens. Here is a 1916 map of the Mendota area, which highlights the land owned by St. Peter's Catholic Church on the western edge of town. These are several old photos of the church, which is made of local limestone. This is a view looking toward the Catholic Church from the east-northeast. The view is definitely looking uphill toward the church. This next view looks the opposite way, from the church hill back to the east-northeast. The Faribault House is located in Mendota, near the railroad tracks. The Faribault House was also built of the local limestone. Finally, the Sibley House was right next to the Faribault House. The Sibley House was also built of the local limestone. This 1923 aerial photo is the earliest available aerial photo of the Junction area. It shows the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers and Fort Snelling and Mendota. It also shows the railroad line between Mendota and Fort Snelling. In 1937, another aerial photo was taken of the Junction area, and an interesting feature is shown inside the red rectangle. This is one of the junctions of the rivers, and you can see the interesting pattern made when the 2 different colors of water mix. Here is another aerial photo of the Mendota to Fort Snelling area, where you can see both junctions between the rivers. Now let's focus on the area within the red rectangle. This is the railroad line that extended around Fort Snelling to the Minnesota River Bridge. The black line shows how fill was used to elevate this portion of the line, while the small white line shows where limestone arches were built to allow ferry traffic to pass underneath. This old photo of the Mendota Ferry shows the elevated railroad line in the background, clearly much higher than the river bottoms. Now, let's look a little further south and east of the first red rectangle. This is the portion of the railroad line from the Minnesota River Bridge to Mendota. Again, the black line shows where fill was used to elevate the railroad line above the height of any river flooding. Piling was used in 2 places to allow floodwater to pass through, rather than being backed up. Finally, there was another limestone arch in Mendota, so ferry traffic could pass underneath the railroad. This graphic shows how water could pass through the piled section of the Mendota to Fort Snelling railroad line during flood events, as the filled portion, or black line, acted as a dike. Here is another aerial photo from 1957. Let's zoom into the area within the red rectangle. The feature we are going to look at is the Minnesota River Railroad Bridge. The railroad bridge featured a large stone center pier. The railroad bridge was a swing bridge, meaning it could rotate. The center pier was built out of the local limestone too. The bridge was built to rotate so steamboat traffic could pass through. This old photograph shows the Minnesota River Bridge when it was open. This is a more recent photo after the original wooden bridge structure had been replaced with iron. The Minnesota River Bridge also had 3 side piers, as shown here. This old photo shows 2 of those stone piers, while the third is hidden behind the center pier. Finally, the bridge had a stone abutment on the Fort Snelling side. Looking back at the old ferry picture, this stone abutment can easily be seen in the background. This is a schematic of the Minnesota River Bridge between Fort Snelling and Mendota. The swing portion of the bridge was 249 feet long. Let's take a look at a few old photos of the bridge from the Fort Snelling side of the river. This first photo was taken before 1865 because it shows the bridge and railroad line still under construction. The bridge area is shown within the red rectangle. This is the second view of the completed bridge from a slightly different angle. This is another view from the Fort Snelling side looking at the bridge. The view is clearly taken during a flood event, as all you can see is water. The man could be the photographer's assistant, or maybe the bridge tender. This aerial photo was taken in 1960, and again, we will focus on the area within the red rectangle. Zooming in a little closer, you can see that the railroad bridge has been removed, which occurred in 1957. This is an old photo of the bridge during that removal process. Now let's look at the second area, shown within the red rectangle. You can see the track has been removed from this piling section, but the piles can still be seen. Moving forward another 10 years to 1970, you can see the new Minnesota River channel that had been dug. The new channel was created after the record flood of April 1965 to straighten the river at the junction. If you compare the aerial photos from 1960 to 1970, there had always been a low spot through this area. Quite possibly, the river used to flow through there, somewhere back in time. So, instead of making a looping exit to the Mississippi River, the new channel was dug, and the entrance to the loop was diked, forcing the Minnesota River to the straighter path. A boat crew, like this one, pictured at the swing bridge, likely helped dredge the new river channel. When comparing the 1960 and 1970 aerial photos, the 1960 photo still showed the filled section of railroad line. By 1970, the fill was removed, but you could still see where the line had been. By 1991, the piece of land in between the old river loop and the new straightened section had been named Picnic Island, and it had started to fill in with trees. There is no evidence left of the old railroad line on this 2003 aerial photo. The same goes for 2024, although Picnic Island featured plenty of hiking trails to walk around. I encourage you to stop and visit some of these old sites. It is really a little-known sanctuary from the hustle and bustle going on above. That concludes the video. Make sure to check out my other YouTube videos and my primary website at mnbricks.com.